Welcome, everybody. I'm Neeti, founder of Back to Basics Functional Nutrition. I am the functional medicine nutritionist, and I'm super thrilled today to have an expert in the field of metabolic and cardiac health giving us answers to some of the myths that are going around. So, this is a MythBuster series, and the special guest today is Dr. Philip Ovadia, who is a fit cardiac surgeon and who is working tirelessly to help people stay off his operating table. Thank you so much, Dr. Ovadia, for tuning in and sharing and busting the myths that I'm about to ask you.
Yeah, it's great to be with you again, Neeti, and thank you for everything you've been doing to help spread the word around optimal nutrition.
Awesome. I am happy to do that, and thank you for joining in, Doctor. And I've heard we have heard multiple times that people have like a love hate relationship with fats for the longest time. Mostly hate, love partially with in terms of keto diet, which the trend came in went. I don't know what to call now at this point, but that has been the longest trend. And I've also seen in my South Asian community, particularly, doctor, heart disease is a very big risk factor and is a common occurring. And so of late, I'm starting to hear people following oil-free diet and no oil diet. So I'm like, before even me saying anything about it, I want to know your viewpoint as to what you would say. Uh, does oil-free diet help? It doesn't help. Just tell us your viewpoint, doctor.
Sure thing. So, to step back a moment and how we got to a point where we would consider an oil-free diet to be a healthy one, we really have to 50s, let's say. Prior to the 1950s, no one was really all that concerned about consuming fat. And fat was, a prominent part of the diet. But realize that those were mostly fats in animal products, and those were minimally processed oils, things like olive oil and, used, traditionally, going back many centuries. Starting in the 1950s, of course, there was a concern about the rising incidence of heart disease and what might be causing that.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a camp of thought, there was a hypothesis put forward, and it's important to point out that this was a hypothesis, unproven, that saturated fat in the diet was contributing to heart disease. And there was some science put forward that seemed to support that conclusion and headed down a pathway of low fat diets, of reducing fat in the diet in general. And that was, specifically focused on saturated fat to reduce that in the diet in an attempt to lower the incidence, stop the progression of heart disease. Now, over the 70 years since then, what we have seen is that heart disease has not really gone away. It remains the number one killer in the United States and worldwide. Our consumption of fat in general and saturated fat in particular has gone down. And in exchange for that, our consumption of processed food and carbohydrates, in particular, processed carbohydrates, as well as, processed oils, vegetable and seed oils, which were really, only introduced into our food supply within the past 100 years, and saw our consumption of them increase exponentially, over the past 70 years. So, that on a macro level would kind of indicate that this may not be the right approach to reducing heart disease because, as I said, it really has not had a noticeable impact on the incidence of heart disease. There was a minimal reduction in the incidence of heart disease from about 1970 to about 1990, but that is largely attributable to the decrease in smoking during that time. And since 1990, our incidence of heart disease, this is looking at the trends here in the US, but they are similar in other places. The incidence of heart disease has leveled off. And in fact, over the past 5 to 10 years, the incidence of heart disease is actually rising again in the United States. So very concerning trends.
Wow. Yes, it is absolutely very concerning. And so, like you said, 1970s and 1990s, when it had reduced, it was mainly due to smoking, but it was briefly understood as people avoiding saturated fats, and that's why they thought that, hey, that's the way to go, and low fat diet is helping. So that's why people went on to consume canola oil, I guess, and that trend continue. But what that is a wonderful point that you bring up, tying in the history, because that absolutely makes sense, Dr. Ovadia. And how do you see, like, the clients coming into your practice? Do you see, or do you hear from time to time people going on an oil-free diet?
Yeah, so this is a common scenario that I deal with. People oftentimes come to me having been on, low fat diets, which include, oil. Oh, we're back. Sorry. So I do have a number who come to me having been on a low fat, including oil free diet for a period of time, and yet they have seen progress. So, they are concerned with that. And, really, whenever we're looking at a diet, we have to keep in mind 2 aspects of diets. And all diets have this in common. You're taking things out. And whenever you're taking something out, it obviously we need to eat something. So the trade-off when you take fat out of the diet is usually that you're going to be substituting carbohydrates, because we only have 2 energy sources. We have fat and we have carbohydrates are the only energy sources that our bodies can effectively utilize. So you end up having to trade one for the other. And I would say that the totality of the evidence at this point, would indicate that carbohydrates, especially highly processed carbohydrates, which oftentimes are what are put into foods that are now low fat, are more damaging to our health than the fat ever was. So, I am not a fan of oil-free diets. And I think the low-fat diet approach in general has now been tested extensively and has failed. So it is not my preferred approach. I will say that you can, with low-fat diets, if you are comparing them to the standard American diet. So it is very clear from the data that high fat combined with high carb, which is basically the standard Western diet, it is the worst thing for your health.
Right.
And you can show improvement by removing either, if you go fat free or very low fat, you can show improvement. If you go carb free or very low carb, you can show improvement. So both of them will get people improvement, but that doesn't answer the question as to what is optimal, and that really would require head-to-head comparisons of these, low fat diets and these low carbohydrate diets in very well rigorously controlled studies. And unfortunately, those haven't been done over the long term. In the short term, they have been compared. In general, low carbohydrate diets do better in terms of weight loss, do better in terms of appetite control. But both, as I said, have demonstrated effectiveness when compared to a standard Western diet, which is high fat and high carbs simultaneously.
Awesome. Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up because typically when one something is removed, something gets added. So, like you said, people removed fat, but they added carbs back in. So, which is not helping. And like you said, the oil-free, low-fat diet or oil-free diet is gonna give results in short term, but how can we translate that into long term? Like what would the effect be, doctor, if someone continues to be on a low fat or a oil free diet for, like, say a year, 2 years, like the longest time possible? Is that
Yeah,
sustainable?
yeah. So ultimately, we have to realize that fat is essential to human life. You can survive without eating carbohydrates. You cannot survive without eating protein, and you cannot survive without eating fat. There are a number of vitamins that are fat soluble, that are essential vitamins. Specifically, vitamins A, D, E, and vitamin K are all fat soluble vitamins that are essential for us to get. So that becomes a problem if you're going to be on a fat-free diet. You can do supplementation, but that's probably not as effective as getting it from food. And then there is a well-described condition. It's called rabbit starvation. And it's named that because rabbits are naturally lean animals. And back in I believe it was the 1800s, maybe even 1700s, it was a described phenomena that, hunters who were relying only on rabbits and other lean game, lean wild animals, would over time develop health issues. And, again, in retrospect, those health issues are probably related to the vitamin deficiencies from not having fat and in the diet. So, you really can't sustain fat-free diets for a long time. Now, low-fat diet, probably is, you can get, as long as you get sort of a minimum threshold and you account for these vitamins. Can you do it? Yes. But it tends to be a very difficult diet to maintain, as anyone who has done low-fat diets will attest to. They are very difficult to maintain over the long term.
Got it. Yes. And I love that you mentioned rabbit starvation because the hopefully that people can relate to, and you can even Google the term and you can find out studies that can come up because, like you said, rabbit starvation, it can lead to vitamin deficiencies, fat soluble vitamin deficiencies in the long run. So it is, we know that it is not sustainable, but at the same time it is hurtful to the health, which the sooner people knows the better. And have you seen like would low fat diet or oil free diet, would that help with the LDL levels? Because these days people are mainly tracking their LDL levels, right? So they think LDL is equals to low LDL equals good heart health. So what would you say in that terms?
Yeah, well, so, do these diets lower LDL levels? The answer to that is yes, they do. Is that a good thing? Is a really unanswered question and a more complex question to delve into. Realize that when most of these diets lower LDL, they lower HDL with it as well. And so you're really lowering, and I'm not a big fan of the terms good and bad cholesterol, but clearly there are good and bad cholesterol particles, and low fat diets tend to lower cholesterol particles across the board. So you're going to be lowering the good with the bad, and it's not so clear that that is a net benefit. As I've discussed extensively, as many others have discussed extensively, the relationship between LDL cholesterol levels and the development of heart disease is not as clear as we have been led to believe. And it's a very complex issue. Beyond the scope of this conversation, all I would say to most people is, if you are basing your entire dietary approach on your LDL cholesterol level, that is probably not a good metric to be basing, your decisions upon, because the issue around heart disease and cholesterol is way more complex than simply one number on a blood panel.
Exactly. We are complex human beings, and we just like to throw answer in yes and no. And so the simplified version we look at is in terms of LDL, but that is not the solution. So I'm so glad you were able to throw light on this complex topic, because it's not that simple. But at the same time, just sticking to one part of the diet is not enough. Eat real foods, eat complex foods, and get the benefits. So thank you for doing this MythBuster series with me, Dr. Ovadia, and I'm just hopeful that this message reaches the people who are following it mindlessly, and they can make informed decision based on our conversation. Thank you so much again.
Great to see you again, Nidhi.